Swipin Thru history has the honour to welcome you to the Knights of Middle England, where chivalry, heraldry and rivalry flourish in a 21st century world full of typing and swiping. In this week's special content, we will be looking at how the spirit of the joust lives on and how all of us, the modern peasantry, have the chance to be knightly too. What is jousting? Well, it's a medieval contest where two knights charge towards each other on horses, wielding lances. The goal is simple: to hit your opponent, to unhorse your opponent, and to defeat your opponent. So, you know the rules. There's only one thing left to do. Let me introduce you to my very own medieval horses and their knights in shining armour. Here at the tilt yard in Silverstone, I present to you Sir Lewis of Hamilton, riding the beautiful and slick Mercedes. And then his challenger for today, none other than the one, the only Max of Verstappen, riding the somewhat sturdier Red Bull. Now they give each other the eye contact. They line themselves up on the tilt. The lords, they nod their head. The heralds give their introductions. And it's lights out and away we go. Hamilton has a fantastic flying start, but Max's agility still astounds me to this day. Lewis has missed. Max collects Lewis on the way past, crashing into the barrier. Lewis is tangled in the barrier, and Max, wherever Max Verstappen goes, devastation follows. The sport of jousting did develop throughout the medieval period, with styles and rules changing. Early forms of the joust did not actually see two knights charging at each other on other sides of the tilt, but were instead massed brawls of knights without really any ceremony involved, and they often took place across acres of countryside. The tournament has its origins in the military tactics of heavy cavalry during the Middle Ages, and was originally training for war. Tournaments were the best means of teaching and refining the skills and abilities necessary within a more controlled environment than actual warfare. But by the late 1300s, it had developed into what we now know as the joust. So why did they joust? For honour, glory, and riches. To be the best. What does that remind you of? Today, we can compare the joust to almost any sport, really, be it rugby, football, boxing. But the one sport that I really feel it relates to the most in every possible way is Formula One. Drivers today, they have fierce personal rivalries. They adhere to the etiquette, chivalry of the racetrack, and they wear their own suits of armour, often personalised to represent their own ideals and what they believe in. At the Knights of Middle England, it is the relationship between horse and rider. At the racetrack, it is the relationship between driver and machine. And underlying all that is the danger. Drivers today, as with knights back then, they are on the edge, putting their lives on the line to achieve what matters most. That is why we love them, and that is why we live through them. The medieval era has developed a romanticism about it. Knights living by a chivalric code, adhering to virtues such as honour, truth, and loyalty. This code may no longer be such an important presence in our society, but we do still admire and learn from those who live by a set of core values that we relate to. The crowds would cheer on a knight for who he was and what he stood for, like we cheer for a driver because of who they are and their personality. They become role models for the younger generations to look up to and aspire to be. Heraldry was all about showing people who you were. Once the helm had been developed and knights were no longer recognisable on the battlefield, they resorted to heraldry to identify who was who. Symbolic monsters and animals exploded onto the scene, garnishing shields and armour. The heraldry, it was not just about identifying who was who, but it also represented what the knight stood for. I mean, you could say it was an early form of branding. Today, the drivers' helmets erupt with colour and symbolism. People travelled far and wide across the European kingdoms to witness their knights challenge the fiercest of rivalries. The sport of jousting became so popular that regulations came into play and kings had to restrict the number of jousts just to prevent the case where war breaks out and his knights were off gallivanting at some tournament ground. Rivalries, they were fierce. Knights winning wealth and horses should they be successful. Even in the early years of the joust, when it was more of a melee, knights had their footmen or kippers follow them onto the field with clubs and blunt weapons, ready to batter any fallen opponent unconscious just to collect the spoils of war. It was a violent sport and deaths were not uncommon. But as with motorsport today, safety measures were developed to try and reduce the number of deaths. After all, losing knights on the tournament ground was in no one's best interests. If they were destined to die anywhere, it would be on the battlefield. Although we focus mainly on the knights, jousting was by no means a one-man sport. They would have had their teams of squires and servants from their households working with them, and of course let's not forget the most important team member of all, the horse. A knight's horse would have been his most prized possession, and the value of a medieval war horse would have been the equivalent to that of a modern-day sports car. Now the knights of Middle England, they are the perfect example of how devoted a knight would have been to his horse. The horses, they're expertly trained and they're looked after by the very best. And the trust developed between a knight and his horse would have been vital if they wanted to win at the tilt. When rider and horse work as one, they can overcome anything. Jousting may have changed over the years and it no longer leads the way in sport, but there are a small group of people keeping the sport alive and it attracts hundreds of thousands of spectators every year to tournaments and shows across the globe. I myself have fallen in love with the gallantry and the symbolism of the joust, and now, like never before, thanks to Knights of Middle England, anyone can have a go. So we here at Swipin Thru History are honoured to be working with them, and we look forward to playing our part in helping them complete their quest. The spirit of the joust will live on. Now Lewis, you remember what I told you? You keep that lance couched, you keep close to the tilt, and you keep your eye on that target. No excuses. Higher! Higher! Higher!